Awesome. You want to kick it off, Michael?
Sure. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining our first VEBA Community Call. We're all excited. It's good to see old and new names here on the call. So I just want to talk a little bit about the format of this community call, and because it's the first one, we'll definitely also want to hear from you whether that's useful and we should continue doing that. So the current plan is that this call is supposed to be for all the VEBA users and the community out there. And that means you can bring questions, feedback. We don't always will have like a formal packed agenda, I think. So for this one, obviously, there's a couple of talking points that we just added to kick this one off. But in general, I think we want to keep this open and have you speak or even present or ask questions. And if we don't have like a packed agenda, we can also make it very custom in terms of maybe reviewing PRs that are pending or so for the hour that we're doing. The plan is that we do this monthly, every last Tuesday in the month. And we try to make this a like time zone friendly time for at least Europe and US based folks. And I think most of the folks here on the call are either US or Europe based. Yeah, so that is what this call is all about, basically the community. And then we got a couple of agenda items, but before we'll move on, William, anything from your end?
No, I think it's, like Michael mentioned, this is really for the VEBA community, both existing users, but also potential prospects, right? That if you're interested in what can be done in event-driven, if you've not used a solution and you've got some interest or you've got some questions, this really is the place for you to be able to interact with both myself, Michael, but also other folks within the team and others in the community. These things sort of exist in other community forums and works really well for idea sharing. If you're trying to solve a particular problem, may not know how to get started. In fact, a lot of the early function development has been contributions from a lot of the community and kind of cross-pollinating sharing. And so I think this is a really awesome format. I know that we can all get tired of all these virtual Zooms and all that. And so we hope to make this as lively as possible. Feel free to interact with us, either unmuting yourself or just asking questions in the chat, and we have multiple folks that's monitoring, and hopefully we can keep this as interactive as possible. Thanks.
Cool, nice. So before we move on, any points, discussion topics from you guys on the call here? If you don't want to unmute, you can also put them in the chat, just so we see there's a lot of topics too.
I have a question about the Horizon integration.
Sure, let me put it on the agenda.
I've also implemented the Horizon Reach, and there's a lot of login, log-off processes going on. I was looking maybe to exclude some things in the notifications, if that was possible.
Right. Cool, I took a note. We'll discuss this. Thanks, Sydney. Okay, nothing in the chat. Looks like we're good then. Let's do a quick VMworld recap. William, I didn't ask you for like preparing this, but do you want to give a quick recap on what we've done at VMworld with the team and
Sure.
the recent release that we did?
Yeah, I don't have anything planned. But I can certainly talk about some of the net new feature functionality. Yeah, so we just had our VO7 release. This came out back in start of October, I think like the first week of October. And this is a pretty packed release, and we even have a VMworld session, and the session recently just got published online. Actually, let me just drop this in the chat for Michael. If you want to just add that. And so if you've not seen the session, these are all VMware code sessions that were posted on the YouTube channel. So they just got published, I think, just a couple of days ago. And with this release, one of the big features that we've added is obviously a new additional event providers. So now we support VMware Horizon. So it looks like we already have some users like Sydney already consuming the new capability. And so if you have VMware Horizon, you can now start consuming its events, and they have over 850 plus events that are available for you to consume. One of the examples we gave is, failed login to the admin Horizon portal, right? There's no two-factor authentication. You probably want to understand who's logging in, especially around failed attempts or for auditing purposes. So that's really quite nice. On top of that, we also have a generic cloud event webhook provider. And what this allows you to do is actually ingest non-vSphere, non-Horizon events from other systems that you might have. This could be VMware second-party solutions, but this can also include third-party solutions, even including solutions from the public cloud. So if you're able to construct basically a custom webhook that conforms to a cloud event, which is what VEBA consumes internally as it publishes events for vCenter and Horizon, you can now actually consume these third-party events and actually reuse some of the functions that you may have built. A really easy example could be, hey, I want to send a Slack notification. So now you can react to vSphere events, Horizon events, but I can also react to other custom events, right? These other custom events could be maybe from VROps, maybe they come from AWS, maybe from Azure, any system that basically can construct an HTTP request that conforms to the specification, you can now consume this functionality. And this is out of the box within the appliance, right? So it's a new OEF property that you just fill in the credentials that you want to set up, and then it's automatically set up for you. So we see a lot of interesting capabilities. And in fact, some of our teammates have done some things with, Horizon Edge services and be able to monitor like the UAMs and UAGs for various events that's interested out of that system where they may not have like a notification built into the platform. There's also a number of day 2 improvements that have come out of the VEBA 07 release, one of which is around monitoring your resources. We have a lot of customers asking about, how much CPU, memory, storage is being used by some of these functions. And so one of our teammates, Robert on the call, has implemented cAdvisor. And this not only gives you some visibility, but it also enables you to hook into other solutions like vRealize operations. And so if you're a customer that has VROps, you can actually connect and actually download the management pack that Robert has built in. So now it gives you full visibility into the Kubernetes layer that's running within the appliance. Similarly, on the logging aspect of it, we also have added capabilities for syslog. So we're implementing Fluent Bits. And so now you can actually get all the logs from your functions in your Kubernetes infrastructure out of the VEBA appliance. This could be also useful for debugging purposes. Imagine if you're writing functions, instead of having to log into the appliance or log in remotely, I can just go look to a logging system and be able to take a look at the output of my function. Maybe you're enabling some verbose logging. It makes it very easy to go from one place rather than having to have multiple users log in. So another nice enhancement that was added by our colleague Robert. And then lastly, we have a number of functions. I think this past month or so, I've been working on a number of different functions, from sending messages over SMS using Twilio, Telegram. We also have a number of integrations with VMware Cloud Notification Gateway. So just lots of examples that you can base off of. There's some really fun ones like monitoring your VM management snapshots. That's a concern that a lot of customers have, is that, snapshots are being created by different users. They want to have some type of a management policy for it. And today there's nothing built into vSphere. So one really easy thing that you can set up is, set up a retention period to say, I only want so many snapshots, or I only want the snapshot to exist for so long before I want to automatically commit the snapshot so that it doesn't grow out. I can also do it by size. And so we published a very simple snapshot management function that basically creates a scheduled job, kind of like a cron job, for example. And this can all be done using VEBA and the Knative framework. And so not only can you build functions that react to specific events, a scheduled task itself is also an event. And so this is really powerful to start to have, certain types of workflows that are more task-based, checking for the snapshot age, and maybe you want to run a compliance report. And so these things are quite powerful from that standpoint. And then lastly, we also have a number of updates to the VEBA website to make it a lot more friendlier. We've revitalized a lot of the content. And so we definitely invite you to take a look at the website, and hopefully it makes it easier for you to consume. So that was a quick summary of what we had in our VMworld, /V07 release.
Thanks, William. Any questions on the release or feedback? Someone tried it? Good. So speaking of releases, the next planned release, so there will be a dot release, 07.1, in like a couple of weeks or so. There has been some changes or updates to the documentation, more functions, and so on. So we're planning definitely another release, at least until the end of this year. But we're also in parallel working on the 08 release. 08 has currently two major milestones, if you will. One is metric support, which currently in VEBA, we do have a bunch of metrics on the event router, the core piece of doing that does the event routing logic, but they are stateless, meaning if the router crashes or restarts, or if you reboot the appliance, the metrics are gone because they're just kept in memory. And so the idea there is that we will add support for metric providers like Prometheus and Tanzu observability called Wavefront, and maybe even more. So that is also depending on your feedback, community feedback of what you want to see. But this is definitely an area that we want to improve on. And the other one is we announced deprecation of OpenFaaS and AWS Event Bridge in the 07 release. So it's still there, but it's marked as deprecated, these processors. In 08, they will be removed from the appliance deployment. So you won't be able to deploy the appliance with either AWS Event Bridge or OpenFaaS as part of the processor. And this is because we have, since a couple of releases, already migrated to Knative as the backend in our appliance. And Knative offers a couple of capabilities that these two providers don't. And so we are like positive that any use case is already captured by Knative, and also a couple of more use cases being unlocked by the Knative backend. Is there anyone who wants to share feedback on this on these two epics that we're working on the deprecation or metric support? Cool. Maybe if you want to put in the chat like a +1 or so on the metrics side, or if there's other stuff that you rather see us prioritize on, feel free to drop a note there. But I feel metrics is an area where we need to improve, definitely. Then we have a request and the ask to the community. So we have a couple of users. Let me quickly open the chat. More metrics, yeah, good feedback. The next point is the user feedback. And so we are thinking of adding on the VEBA website names or logos or quotes from users like using the VEBA appliance. And so we are already lucky to have Scott, like we featured Scott and Tara's guy in our VMworld presentation. And I'm sure Scott is positive about like dropping a name and a note there on the website as well. So we do definitely want to feature you and your use cases, especially if you made contributions to the VEBA project. And so we're thinking about doing that, but obviously we need a handful of these names to begin with. So if you are open to share your company or your name or how you're using VEBA, that would definitely be great. And feel free to put that on Slack or DM us or reach out to us on the various channels too. William, any comment on this one from your end?
No, that's it. That's good.
Yep. Cool. Speaking of use cases, William, you created this document. Let me just open it up, and maybe you can share a bit on this one.
Yeah, no, thanks. So speaking of use cases, we've been talking to a lot of customers, especially post VMworld. There's been certainly a lot of interest, both new users as well as existing users. So it's really been fantastic to actually see the number of folks that have learned something about VEBA during VMworld. And one of the most common questions that we get is sort of like, hey, can I do this particular use case, or how does it work, or what have other users been doing? So along the lines of sharing, we also wanted to aggregate all the use cases that we've come across. This is both from our GitHub repository, from the issues that folks have filed, as well as just talking to customers in general. And so I initially put this list together. I think there's over like 70+ entries in here. Obviously, this is not inclusive. And in fact, this is probably maybe like 1% of what can be done with VEBA. So it's quite a powerful system, right? Especially when you look at events coming from vSphere or Horizon. There's several thousand events, right? And the use cases are plentiful. But what I wanted to do is be able to put down some of these use cases that our users are actively doing today. And if there are use cases that you're exercising with VEBA that's not captured here, feel free to open up an issues or PR and just contribute here. I think this is really helpful for net new users to understand what are some of the things that can be done with VEBA that they didn't think was possible. But also another place where other users in the community who are using VEBA can actually look and see what others are doing with VEBA, and maybe they might get a good idea or get motivated to try something out, right? There's plentiful use cases, like I mentioned. A lot of these are quite interesting, and some of these are painful if you were to do it, without VEBA. And so I think this is a really great resource, and hopefully we'll have more folks contributing on the different things that they've been using. And so if you see something interesting, feel free to shoot a note and just submit a PR request, and we'd be happy to incorporate your use case and writing just like a basic one-line sentence on basically what you've been able to accomplish.
Cool. And another benefit of capturing these use cases is that this also influences like the productization of the VEBA. So you might know that there is this VMware product called Cloud Native Runtimes, and Cloud Native Runtimes shares a lot of similarities between VEBA and vice versa. And so we are in close contact with obviously the product teams there, and they are always keen to hear about use cases. So documenting them out there in the open always also drives like influences the product direction at the end of the day. So that's definitely great. I forgot to share that we have a roadmap, a public roadmap page on GitHub. You can find that in the vCenter, like in the VEBA repository, and then in projects. And then there's a project called Roadmap. And Roadmap, we track items that we are planning to do in a couple, like in the upcoming releases. And so VEBA is not a product, so we don't like have fixed cadence or release schedules, but it just turned out that over the last kind of years, like 2 years, we had a quarterly release cycle. And so the roadmap is structured similar. And for all the items that are like up for discussion or currently not implemented, or it's unclear when, then we'll put them in future here. And we do a triage of these issues. So they are all issues in the from the repo, and then we assign them to the respective milestone or quarter, if you will. And one of the also important topics that we are working on is this topic here, which is issue 632. And this is called Migrate to Using vSphere Sources. And what it means is that VEBA currently has this custom event router implementation where we implement a lot of the logic to talk to different event sources like vSphere, Horizon, webhook, and so on. But in parallel, we also evolved a native Knative implementation for talking to vSphere, and that is called the vSphere source for Knative. So you can even find that on GitHub. And this is a public repo as well. And this is basically the productized quote version of the VEBA vSphere bits for Knative. And so our goal is to have users who either use a product like Cloud Native Runtime, which use the sources here, or users coming from the VEBA appliance to have the same experience when they write functions. So the best case is that you write your function maybe on VEBA, and then you deploy a commercial product like Cloud Native Runtime, and you don't have to change anything on your function. Now, as of today, this is not strictly true. So there are a couple of semantical differences when it comes to how the event looks like when it's coming from the source versus coming from the VEBA router. And so we're working on harmonizing that, meaning there will be some minor changes to the VEBA vSphere implementation of how these events look like, so that we have basically transparency when you either use the VEBA or the vSphere sources after we make this change. And this is merely for user adoption and consistency across these different implementations. And any questions on this one, on the roadmap in general or the vSphere sources in particular? And the whole terminology can be confusing. So if something wasn't clear, I'm happy to repeat.
With the roadmap, are you guys looking to also have like a feature request page, or would that be driven by posted issues?
Yes, issues have, when you do new issue, there's a feature enhancement or
Okay.
request, right? And then there's even a template which describes what you want to see and achieve. And then once the issue is filed, then usually William will take a look and assign a milestone or put it in a roadmap somewhere.
Yeah, that's a great question, Aaron. If you go back one more, Michael, I was just going to say the roadmap basically constructed out of the issues. And so for any way
issues, sorry,
this one, yeah, and if you just click on new issue real quick, and so if you're not familiar with GitHub, I know some folks just haven't used it before. This is basically how we kind of interact with the community for bug tracking purposes. And so you think you've identified a bug or even just an issue, go in and come into GitHub, it's a free account. And then we basically have two templates. One is a general bug report issues. And if you click on get started, there is a pre-canned template that will ask you to basically fill out. And that just gives us a little bit more information to help you out, right? If you have ideas for enhancements, maybe enhancements that you might want to contribute to or whatever it may be, go in and click on the second one. Again, that will give you a template. And basically these will create particular issues in GitHub with particular tags for it, right? And then we use this as a way to basically decide and have discussions on it. And so if you have an idea for an enhancement, we can have an open discussion. And then based on that feedback, right, that may turn into a PR that either you contribute to or somebody in the community will take up or from the core team. And so that's one way of basically requesting feedback. And if you have some ideas where you're not sure yet, this is a great forum to have those discussions. Like if there's something that you would love to see in VEBA that just does not exist today, or not something that we're looking into, certainly this is a great place to kick off the discussion. Also, we have our VEBA Slack channel. I know, Aaron, you've been on there, lots of great discussion there. Maybe you start your discussion there. And then if we come to some basic consensus, like, hey, this sounds like a great idea. How about you go and file an issue so that we can actually track it for progress? Other folks can actually comment and say, hey, that's a great idea as well. And so a lot of our roadmap and functionality that we've been building for VEBA for the past 3 years has been 100% driven from the community, right? Michael and I had an idea of what we'd like to deliver and enable the community, but really the underlying functionality has really been derived from everyone in the community. So we really are keen to listen and hear what are some of the things that you'd like to see and areas that are improved. So hopefully that helps.
Cool, thank you.
Yep.
Cool, next item is, there was a proposal or question during the VMworld session that we did from someone, I don't know, maybe he's also here today, asking whether VEBA is participating in the Hacktoberfest initiative, which runs every year. At least I know it's annual. It works in a way that if you want to have a project participating in that, you just need to nominate it. So VEBA would have to be nominated to the Hacktoberfest page here. And then there would be issues or PRs or whatever being marked with a label on our repository as Hacktoberfest. And that encourages users to contribute, making like even their first contribution. Could be docs, could be features, whatever works during this time of the Hacktoberfest. And it's merely like a special awareness time for contributing to open source projects. Nothing that you couldn't done without the Hacktoberfest, but it's just kind of to drive awareness there and gain more people and awareness on the project as well. And I think this is a great idea. For this year, it's almost over, I think. So the sign up is almost done. And so I would have to take a look at this more closely, but maybe for next year, this could be a good idea. And this was also—
Yeah, I think this is a good one. I actually got asked about this for my other open source project. And my understanding, and I didn't look into the full details, was that they were referencing another repo that had it. And it looked like all you needed to do to make a repo qualify was, I think there was like some tag that you add called Hacktoberfest. And then obviously if the user, there was some mentioning of like flags and all that, but then they pointed this other repo, and the only difference there was that the repo had this additional topic that had Hacktoberfest. So I haven't looked into detail, so it's possible there may be additional things. We should definitely get this on the docket for next October. You're right, we only have a few days left of the year, but yeah, definitely a great idea.
Okay, Hacktoberfest.
And actually, speaking of like contributions and community, we have a number of folks here. How many of you are new to VEBA, or is everybody here currently a VEBA user? feel free to raise your hand if you're a new user. I think there's like a little emoji icon, or just mention in Slack that you're new to VEBA, just so we get a sense of who's been an active user or who's just using it for the very first time. So it looks like James is not used VEBA before, and then Althea is also new, aware but haven't used it extensively. Sam is kicking the tires on the 07 release. Oh, fantastic. So we got a mix of good existing users and as well as net new users. So I think it's also great to also hear if there are things that's interesting for the new users. I think for the existing users, appreciate your support and your continued usage of the solution. But are there any just questions, things that you're wondering about, or things that you might consider now that you kind of have a overall understanding of what's available there? We certainly recommend checking out the VMworld session. It goes through quite a bit of information. In fact, we even demonstrate how to go from an idea to writing your first function to deploying it into VEBA. And there's a lot of really nice enhancements in the 07 release that makes it very easy for you to develop functions. So kind of curious if anybody has any ideas. We've been talking for a little bit of time now, kind of curious about the new folks to see if you've got any ideas or thoughts around some of the functionality that VEBA can deliver.
Hi, this is James. I did have a question regarding VEBA and how to integrate it with multiple vCenters, or how are people doing that out in the wild? We've got 5 different vCenters in our environment. I'm just wondering, should we deploy a VEBA appliance per vCenter, or is it one VEBA appliance that connects to all 5 at the same time?
No, that's a great question, James. Thanks for asking. Yeah, there's kind of like 2 models. So if you take a look at the appliance today, right, it's really a virtual appliance running Photon OS. And then inside of that appliance, we have Kubernetes running. It's a 1-node Kubernetes, right? So it's not out of the box highly available. And that's partially by design to make it easy to consume. And then we have the event router. And that's the heart of our solution, right? And today, the event router has a 1-to-1 mapping. And there's a number of reasons for that architectural design. Michael can certainly spend more time going through it, but ideally we want to make sure that we reduce the blast radius and fault domain, right? Just like any other system that you might distribute. And it all depends on the size of a given vCenter. We have some customers that have some very chatty vCenter server because there's a lot of stuff happening. And we have some customers that have smaller vCenter servers, but we want to design it in a way where a given event router, if it were ever to go down or if it got overrun by a given vCenter, it does not affect other systems, right? Especially as we add new event providers. So we decided to have this 1-to-1 mapping. And so what that means, if you were to deploy the VEBA appliance form factor, you would have to deploy multiple VEBA appliances to map to each of your individual vCenter servers. Now, that is not the only way to deploy VEBA. The other mechanism for VEBA is actually, because it is a Kubernetes-based application, customers can also deploy, basically the internals of VEBA into an existing Kubernetes cluster. And we have a number of customers who have a fair amount of vCenter servers. We're talking dozens to 100 plus. And in that model, they may not want to deploy the appliance, and they have maybe one or multiple large Kubernetes cluster, and they're only deploying the event router component. And all it is basically just a YAML manifest, right? That contains your mapping to your vCenter server. And you can use something like Helm to help you automate and speed that delivery up there. And in that case, you're just simply deploying N number of these event router containers that are fairly lightweight, and that has this mapping to each of your vCenter servers. So those are the 2 models that we see customers deploying. It just really depends on which model you're currently using. If you don't have like a Kubernetes infrastructure or experience with Kubernetes, you might use the appliance, which is still predominantly the most popular one.
Thank you for that.
Yep. Any other questions, either from Altia or even Sam, as you guys were listening and kind of kicking the tires, hopefully with the VEBA appliance? And then feel free to throw the questions on chat if you don't want to unmute. Totally fine.
Here, I'll go ahead and say it. I was in the middle of typing something. Is there anything on the roadmap or plan to have VEBA monitor itself to be able to trigger off events based on maybe something within the Kubernetes stack that the VEBA appliance is running on, that might indicate that there's a health problem with VEBA or something along those lines. I haven't had a chance to mess with .7 yet, but we previously talked about issues I've had with the file system filling up on the .6 release. I've worked around that, but just trying to think of anything that could be done to monitor the appliance, the functions, just so that we can have a good sense that they're healthy and running with.
So there, a good question, Aaron. There's a couple of, I would say, topics here. So one is general monitoring of appliances or Kubernetes-based applications, which Robert, for example, has written a great dashboard for VROPS, and we also want to like do better work on the metrics side to support like Prometheus and Wavefront, so that you can get all these metrics out of the box, especially like disk usage and so on, in a proper metrics or monitoring system. Now, from underlying or VEBA itself, like VEBA currently does not generate events. And events can be categorized like in two use cases. One are like technical events. For example, the volumes are filling up or a pod has crashed. And those are the ones we get for free. That's why we don't have to do them in VEBA. We get them for free from Kubernetes. Now, what we haven't deployed with VEBA is there's an adapter in Knative, which lets you connect Knative to Kubernetes. And since we run Knative and Kubernetes in VEBA, we could technically deploy this. And you can then subscribe for particular events, like, for example, when a pod has started or crashed or a deployment has being rolled or upgraded and so on. Now, we're currently not deploying that, but that would be like a manual maybe way to explore it. Knative, it's called Kubernetes API server resource. And again, because we do run Knative under the covers in VEBA, we get a Knative internal server error. Funny. Or maybe I was just routed to a cached. Let's see, that might have been a cached response from the Knative. I hope the Knative website is not down. Well, it's taking. No, it's not down. Perfect. Yeah, and so this is called the API server source. And instead of providers, event providers in Knative, they are called sources. So you will find an API server source, a vSphere source, a ping source, container source, like all these are also event sources, basically providers. And an API server source, you can specify what the resource is that you're interested in. And I don't know if there's an example of a resource, this one maybe here. So this will get all the events generated by Kubernetes related to deployments and pods, and send them into Knative as a proper event. The only requirement there is that the controllers, like deployment controller, pods, and so on, have to emit events like Kubernetes events. Otherwise, you won't see them. And so in your case, you would probably be interested in node events, node disk pressure, right? Something like that, because those are also generated events. So that would be one area. The other one, obviously, the metrics improvements that we're working on. And the third one is you can even write like a custom cron job function, which either talks to Kubernetes or explores the local disk in VEBA, and then fires off a custom event that you're generating, Aaron. That's also possible.
Yeah, that looks like it serviced the function of monitoring the pods themselves. The other health check or monitor point I was hoping to get is when I recently patched my vCenters due to the CVEs that were announced for the 6.7 U3 vCenters just a short while back. That of course restarts all the vCenter services. I kind of half expected that the VEBA was going to see that connection dropped and would reconnect. For whatever reason, it didn't. I don't know if that's expected to do so or not, but if there, again, because I'm relying on VEBA to enforce my OS license management, I have a lot of, I need to try to keep that up and available. I would like to have some understanding and be able to trigger an event on if the vCenter connection to the VEBA internal service function fails. Like that's
Basically
under like
the source.
VMware service namespace.
So what would happen is that the router would retry a couple of times, but then if the issue persists, let's say vCenter doesn't come back up or network issue or so on, then the router would crash and fail. And that is an event you would see through this kind of API server source event.
Okay.
We could think of adding more of these like business events, but when I say business event, this is more like in the domain of VEBA, right, itself. So we could also think of adding more events there and then channel them through the broker. That could be something like an alert. The other thing to note there is that the router itself has a capability of that is called checkpointing. And this comes then to that we had a couple of questions on resiliency, like event delivery guarantees, right?
Yeah.
And so by default, the router does not checkpoint. And so the deployment that we have in VEBA currently also is not checkpointing by default, but it can be enabled. And what that means is that the router will periodically create a persistent checkpoint internally to track where in the vCenter event stream it last successfully processed an event. And if then, let's say you processed event 100, because they are increased, like we have a monotonic counter, which is increasing in the vCenter event. You see the event ID, right? That is the counter which always goes up in vCenter. So we just have to store that. And then if the router crashes or there's a connection issue with VC, if checkpointing is enabled, the router would come back up and then look for the last checkpoint. You would see event 100. And if in the meantime, there were like 200, 300 more events being generated, the router would replay 100 to the last one. So you wouldn't miss an event, but you could see dupes being delivered because we checkpoint asynchronously. We don't checkpoint on every event for performance reasons. But that has to be explicitly enabled in the appliance. And this is also something we are tracking as a feature improvement. So you don't have to worry about that. But right now, since this is a feature that was added during the VEBA release, if we would have this to be turned on, the default, the behavior would have been that you could see event duplicate delivery in your function logic. And since users would not necessarily be ready for this or might not have written the function in a way that it's capable of handling duplicate event delivery, we were at risk of basically breaking functions or like business semantics in our community. And that's why we didn't turn it on. And maybe we'll do in another upcoming release by default. Does that make sense, Aaron?
Yes, thank you.
So given these options that Michael described, is there a particular one of these monitoring aspects, Aaron, that you're more interested in? I mean, in the scenario where you describe where vCenter does go down and it can be, minutes to several minutes, there is this periodic back off period that Kubernetes will eventually retry. And so once that it's able to reestablish that connection, I wasn't sure for your scenario, did you end up rebooting the appliance? Did you just kill the pod? Like, how did you restore the service? And what would be your ideal monitoring option here?
Yeah. So as I've told you guys before, I'm a Knative and Kate's noob, so I'm kind of figuring things out as I go. So I actually found out that the service was offline a couple of days after the vCenter maintenance event, just because everything was hitting the fan that day. And the recovery, I poked around at it, trying to figure out what was going on. All the functions, pods were running properly. So I just killed all the pods, let Kubernetes respawn them, and brought them back online. And then, of course, that allowed it to reconnect to vCenter, and everything was running from that point forward. So as far as ideal, best way to monitor, if it was possible for it to self-monitor and self-heal, that would be, I think it might be a multi-stage approach. If it could monitor itself and do better at recovering from a failure on its own, that would be helpful. But then also, if there's a way that, and I guess I could come up with if I understood it better, it might be easier to do this, but be able to tie into it with like Nagios or some other Zabbix type monitor that I can set up with our NOC team so that they can be alerted if the platform's not responding properly.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it eventually will fix itself. There is a back off period, and so whenever it cannot connect, and so depending on how long your vCenter was down for, hopefully that would have eventually kicked in. Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, that's not the case. I think we can certainly look into maybe VEBA generating, like Michael said, like a basic one, and maybe basically, hey, I've disconnected, just for awareness purposes before any kind of automated resolution, right? So maybe there is maybe a password change, right? Like any number of things could cause that disconnect, but today there is not really something that's out of the box, and so maybe the router itself could potentially publish the event, assuming it's in some running state or functional state where maybe you can send something to the broker, and we have a specific function that maybe you just get a notification like via Slack or something like that, where like, hey, the connection disconnected, right? And at least that you're informed about, and you can at least take a look at it. Maybe that could be an option. I don't know, Michael, do you have any thoughts around that?
I think it makes sense. And this could also be implemented in the sources. So when we talk about the router, we always have to also keep in mind the vSphere sources for Knative, because eventually we want to like harmonize them. And even there, we could implement this too. We just have to categorize kind of some key events or alerts that we do want to trigger off.
Yep. Yeah, it could be like a good enhancement just for the router and sources, like just say like I've disconnected. Doesn't mean that it's not reconnected, but at least there's a awareness. And generally when I look at these types of requests, it's kind of like a two-parter. The initial thing is just notifying and just being aware that this thing happened. And then we can kind of take a look at what is the ideal state in the future, where if this is automatically recovered, or there's a better way to ensure that gets recovered in a proper manner and timely, right? Especially for monitoring things like licensing, I can understand you don't want to be down for too long. Yeah, no, that's a good one. We can take back and have some discussions on. Thanks for that, Aaron.
All right. Thank you, guys.
I did see a comment from Sydney around app volumes. There's nothing out of the box today. So today our official integrations are with vSphere, as you know, and also with Horizon. With app volumes, depending on, right, because app volumes was a acquisition by VMware, and I'm not too familiar with kind of the end user computing product lines and all that. So depending on where app volume sits in that space, if there is an integration into Horizon, and Horizon emits those particular events, and you can take a look at that. In fact, let me just drop the link for the Horizon events, and you may see some app volume functionality in there. And if it exists in there, and you've got a particular event that you're interested in, then you can certainly react to that. If it's app volumes, the system itself, we don't have any direct integration, but if any of these solutions, whether it's VMware or not, if it has the ability to call into an external webhook, and you can control things like the headers and the payload, then that means that you have everything that you need, hopefully, to construct a cloud event. Then option one is to enable the native cloud event provider in VEBA, which is available in the 07 release, right? So when you check that box, we basically expose an additional endpoint, and now it's actually able to listen for custom events. And as long as you send it in to a particular URL, which is your VEBA appliance, and you can construct it as a cloud event, you can then create a custom event, right? It could be like app volumes unable to mount to a particular VM, and then you can react to it. So that's kind of like the ideal option, right? So if you can construct an HTTP request, and generally you need to either be able to control the headers or the payload, right? There's two different ways of constructing a cloud event, either in binary or structured mode. If you cannot do that, then the second option is that you can actually create a function, any function using any language, right? So I've actually demonstrated this using PowerShell. And this is great for webhooks where you cannot control the headers or the payload. You can only send to a particular endpoint, and it's already an opinionated payload. So you can actually create a function that accepts, basically this very specific type of payload, and then you can transform that into a cloud event. And then that means you can actually reuse that with other functions. So if you've written a function that can just basically send to Slack, you just have this intermediate function that understands your custom payload, say from app volumes, transforms it into a cloud event, and now you can reuse your Slack function. So those are generally the two ways of ingesting custom events into VEBA. So it just really depends on whether or not app volume has the ability to send to like an external webhook, for example. And if it does, then you definitely have some options with VEBA.
And while we are at Sydney, you also had the other question on the Horizon provider, where you see a lot of login, logout events, right? And the question was why that's caused and how you can filter on that. Was that the question?
Yeah, I see a lot of what was it? I can't find it now anymore. But I've also Horizon Reach implemented, and it pulls a lot of times to the Horizon console and logs in and logs out via the REST API. And I see a lot in Sockeye, a lot of kind of events from that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's hard to filter between all those kinds of events.
Yes. Okay. So just to clarify, are you saying that the router is generating all these login events, or other systems are generating these login events?
Another external, the Horizon Reach
Yes.
Fling is
the Fling,
causing this login and logout.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I think the Fling should be, well, in that regards, the Fling should be improved, because we also in VEBA, we have to pull the Horizon API, because we don't get like a persistent stream that we have like in vSphere. So Horizon, the events API is a REST-based API, and you have to continuously pull for this. The way to improve that is to use tokens, session tokens, so you don't have to always authenticate, which then reduces the number of these kind of REST events that you're seeing. So I would definitely raise an issue there with the other Fling team. Now, in order to filter or suppress these events, so VEBA doesn't really care, right? VEBA gives you all the events, and so technically it will just forward them. But you can set a filter either on Sockeye or your function. So let me show you that in Sockeye, because I got it running here. So in Sockeye you have this filter page here on the left, and then you can filter on type, and you could say you're interested in a specific like prefix or suffix, and you right now you can't say everything, but that's not possible in Sockeye. But if you can somehow construct your logic in a way that you can filter out these REST login events, because you're only interested in a particular event, and you can also add multiple filters, that would be something to reduce the noise for these REST events. Or you write your own function, if you want to have a dashboard, for example, and you say, oh, the dashboard should not contain all these REST logins, then you can write your function, and the function will just reduce all, like drop these REST calls, and then send them back to the broker with a specific type, say Sydney's function dot horizon events, right? And then you would only see your own, you can subscribe to your own type, and you would only see them.
Okay, thanks.
And that's a pattern we do a lot, because, for example, alarm events, in alarm events, you'd get a general like alarm status changed event. It doesn't say like this alarm has changed event. It's general alarm status changed event. So it's almost like the fire hose. And that's why in most of the functions, you would have to write additional filtering logic until we get improved filtering in Knative. So that is an outstanding issue in Knative, to improve the filtering logic there, which then obviously would get rid of all the custom logic in your function, which should be the case. You don't want to invoke your function just to like drop an event. You want to do that earlier in the broker. And so there's work currently in Knative to improve filtering there too. Okay.
And the other thing I would add to it too is that if you look at solutions like Horizon, they have different interfaces, right? Their UI is built on top of the REST API. So the application Horizon itself is also doing these logins, right? And it's periodically connecting in through different services. And so at the end of the day, if you look at VEBA, think of it like a physical television. I know most of us are probably watching TV on streaming networks these days, right? But if you remember the old TV, TV shows are being broadcasted. You don't always have to listen to, right? Only if you're interested. Think about VEBA in the same way. VEBA allows us to basically take in all these events, right? And it basically is processing them, right? And it's making them available if you're interested, right? And so if you don't care about, login events, your function doesn't have to listen to them, and they're just there, and they kind of go in and they leave eventually, right? And only if you're interested in it, with the function, when you go and deploy a function, what you're really deploying is a Knative service, and you're also deploying a Knative trigger, and that trigger says, these are the things I'm interested in. If you see this thing, call this container or run this piece of code, right? And so the fact that you have all these different logins, it's also okay, right? Because you may maybe say a year from now, you say, hey, I actually want to see every single login that goes through Horizon because I need to do compliance. You now have that information. So it's okay if VEBA actually has all this stuff, right? It doesn't mean that you need to actually consume it. And so only until you need this information, right, based on the event, that's when you create the function or trigger, and that basically subscribes to certain things. And you can either do that at the envelope level, right, which is kind of what we've talked about. But for more complex events where maybe you just get a generic event, you can also do further processing in your function, because you now have, you know, much more greater flexibility from your code standpoint. You can say, hey, if I see this login only from Sydney, throw it away, right? So you can do a lot more complicated logic from that standpoint. And so if you want to do more of that, then generally we recommend, you know, putting that in your code, and it gives you much greater flexibility on that front as well.
Mm-hmm. Then we had a question from James. If you would want to start Greenfield directly on K8s, should you use the router or the vSphere sources? So James, if you're only interested in getting the vSphere part of the router, then I would recommend going with the vSphere sources, because ultimately that's also what we want to use in VEBA. And we also maintain, like part of our team also maintains the sources there too. So the code base is like 99% identical, just with these minor differences in how the event types are named. And that is just like for historic reasons, there are differences there. But that's the only difference, like basically the envelope, the outer shape of the event. Now, if you're interested in doing more, like say webhook and Horizon, we haven't yet done the work to port this over to sources. So in sources, we definitely want to have a webhook source. We do want to have a Horizon source. But the idea there is that in VEBA, we explore and prototype this with the community. And then once we reach kind of a stability and get enough feedback, then we do want to write a source, which then ultimately will also become part of a product, right? As part of Tensor Application Platform or Cloud Native Runtime or any other Knative-based commercial offering. So that's why we have this like two-stage effort where input type and iterate fast and get your feedback. And then once the feedback is like, hey, Horizon is great and the events look nice, we can start working on putting a source out there. And James, you can also do both. Like if you want to have want to do vSphere events. Am I breaking up, William?
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit. Maybe video or something.
Yeah, sorry. So I'm just going to do the TLDR here because I don't know where I broke up. So James, the recommendation here would be for vSphere events, use the sources if you're going to straight on K8s with Knative. If you also want to have webhook and Horizon support, you can easily deploy the router just with that functionality too. So you wouldn't see the router generating vSphere events because they are already done on the sources side. So you can run them in parallel too and just configure and match if as needed. Does that make sense, James?
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Cool.
Speaking of CNR, I know we have a few more minutes, and then we also have like a demo to kind of show you off before we kind of conclude our first session. Anybody interested in kind of the commercial offering of VEBA? I know that many of you are currently using the Fling, and part of the work in getting the feedback from the community is also porting the functionality into vSphere sources. And so we do have a commercial offering of VEBA through CNR, Cloud Native Runtime. Just curious, anybody on the call here interested in kind of like, you know, officially supported offering of VEBA, as well as the ability to call into support from a SNS point of view? Either raise your hand or leave a comment. Just kind of curious if anybody on this call is interested in kind of the commercial offering. I think we have a few more minutes, Michael. I don't know if you want to start to wrap up and maybe do your quick demo.
Yeah, if we want to do the demo, totally fine. And I think 4 minutes should be good. Otherwise, guys, put stuff on chat and we can handle it. So the idea of the demo was, or is, and let me increase my, no, I need to share my screen, full screen here, is spawned by the fact that vSphere doesn't support preemption. So what is preemption? So the use cases for preemption in a cloud platform are that you either want to offer VMs that are temporarily, like short-lived, often called spot instances, and you can basically terminate them after a couple of time or hour. Or if you have an issue with your cluster and capacity is short, and you want to turn off specific VMs so that other VMs can be powered on, for example. And even though you can use admission and reservations and all the stuff, if you have low priority VMs with their own reservations, vSphere is not going to turn them off. So the idea of this demo was, how can we build an event-driven preemption logic in vSphere that will, under like certain alerts, like thresholds on CPU or memory cluster, or even like schedule-based, power off certain VMs automatically. And so the demo here is, you see my inventory here. It's a vSphere cluster. It's got a production VM and it's got a couple of test VMs. The test VMs, I have assigned a tag called preemptible. And this basically identifies for the function and the workflow then in the back that these VMs can be preempted if there's an issue with the cluster. And so the workflow of this whole demo is that we have vSphere. vSphere generates alerts based on a custom alert that I'm setting. I'm going to show you in a bit. That alert triggers an event. The event goes to VEBA. The event then will be triggering a function in VEBA, which will take the event, look whether the alert is growing, meaning it goes from green to red or green to yellow, or whether it's lowering in terms of from red to green, and make a decision. If it's going up, it's going to kick off a workflow that will identify VMs and power them off. If it's going down, it will cancel any current preemption. And you could improve this with more logic saying that only certain VMs should be powered off, like by priority, or you want to have staged and batches, like do every 5 minutes, do like 10 or so. Like this is highly customizable because at the end of the day, it's a workflow in the back. And the workflow is implemented using a workflow engine, in this case, called Temporal. Temporal is an Uber-based open source workflow engine implementation where you can create some very complex workflows. And why did I use a workflow and not a function? The idea there is that in functions, if you chain multiple functions or if you have large functions, if something goes wrong, it's really hard to reconcile and get back your state. Whereas in a workflow, they are made for these kind of durable executions and running till the end to make sure that your workflow executes successfully. Okay, so let's kick this off just in the interest of time. I hope the demo works. I didn't test it, so just fingers crossed here. And we might need like 2 minutes, so I hope it's okay to run a little bit over time. Can everyone see my screen? Good enough?
Yep, you're good.
Yep,
okay,
looks good.
So this is a memory usage above 5% critical alert. Why 5%? Yeah, well, so that I see the event actually, because otherwise it would never fire. So I'm going to enable it here. And here on the right, you see the workflows that are currently running or have run. I'm filtering it by last 10 minutes because there were a couple of previous attempts last days. So I'm just going to show you. And currently there's no workflow running. And behind in the system, we have the workflow system that is shown here on the left. And then we have our function, which is shown here, but that's not really interesting. And the function is just getting all the alerts and then filtering and sifting through them. And if an interesting one, like the memory one comes in, it basically fires off this preemption workflow. And so it's going to take a bit for vSphere to basically trigger the alert. And you will see the hosts going red in a bit. And then usually it just takes 3 seconds, so it's very fast. And we'll also see an event being generated here in Sockeye. So we'll just wait for that to happen. Okay, so hosts are going red. If we look here, we see that the workflow is already running. The preemption workflow is already running. And if we click on this, it's continuously running this workflow because it's waiting for more events. So it will run until being terminated by the function. And so you can see what it's doing. It's getting a signal, which is the event. Then it's trying to find the preemptible VMs from vSphere based on the tag. Then it's trying to power off the VMs, either forced shutdown or soft shutdown, depending on the criticality. Then it's making an annotation to the VMs, I'm showing you in a bit, and then it's also generating an event. Everything went smoothly because it's green. And you also see a couple of more signals, more events coming in, because what vSphere does, you see 4 hosts going red, you see actually 4 signals coming in for these alerts. We don't want to run the preemption multiple times in a short staggered time. That's why the workflow has logic in there, so it will only run once in a period of like, I think 2 minutes or so, and will discard the other ones. So let's just look for the event. We also get an event from the system, which is nice because we can then send it to Slack to see, oh, preemption kicked in and we have to do something. You will see like what happened, which tag it was, whether it was a forced shutdown, the criticality, the alert that kicked it off, and then the whole vSphere event that triggered this, like alarm status changed event, and also the event, the VMs that were powered off, like these two gentlemen here. And if we see here, the test VMs are powered off. And what you will also see here in the VMs, just to conclude this, is that there is a custom attribute here. And the value, it's hard to see because it's a JSON string that I'm injecting. Let me show you that here. I increase this a little bit. You can retrieve this with govc info, these custom annotations, and then it will show you all the details that you also see in the event. So an administrator can inspect the individual VM, when it was preempted, why it was preempted, who preempted it, which workflow it was, and so on. Okay, so that was rushed. I hope that was still clear and came over as something useful.
No, I think that was a pretty cool use case, right? Is that, we didn't really have this functionality in vSphere, and just simply leveraging, event-driven automation with some workflow engine systems, we're able to basically power off or shut down VMs that are less critical. And Michael could have easily done a secondary workflow that when resources started to return to the cluster, that I'm going to slowly power back on the VMs, again, based on priority and criticality. So you can imagine, certain environments that may not have a lot of resources, you don't want somebody to have to go in and manually figure out which VMs can be powered off. I can just simply use vSphere tags or other ways to basically annotate these VMs and say, hey, these VMs are really important. Never power them off. Make sure that these always get the resources. But for everything else, there's nothing in the system that will say, hey, I'm going to be able to shut down some of these VMs. And so this is a pretty cool concept that, Michael has been talking about. And, with a little bit of work and some workflow engine stuff, this is all done just purely out using VEBA. So I think it's a really interesting concept. And I think we've even talked to some of our engineering teams to see if this is something that might be even interested from a vSphere point of view.
Right. And Aaron was already asking whether, like, I'm doing a write-up. So it will be part of a function example that I'm going to contribute. I'm just wrapping up the code and documenting all the stuff because there's a couple of pieces involved here. But yes, Aaron, it will. Cool. So we're over time, which I wouldn't have expected for the first call. So it's great to see everyone here on the call. Hope to see you guys next time in a month. And if anything comes up, just put us on Slack or email. You know how to find us. Thanks,
Awesome.
everyone.
Thanks. Let me stop the recording.